Russia has issued an ultimatum to Ukraine demanding that it withdraw its troops from the territory of Donetsk region within 2 months. Why is the Kremlin raising the stakes in the war? Why do they set this particular deadline? What's happening on the front lines, and how could all this affect peace negotiations? Let's break it down. Putin's negotiators delivered the demand for troop withdrawal with specific deadlines to Kiev through American intermediaries. If Ukraine refuses, Moscow is threatening to change the terms and put forward even tougher demands regarding Ukraine. On April 1st, all these so called demands were announced at a Kremlin briefing by Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, and then read out in the State Duma's Defense Committee. However, the Kremlin spokesperson got a bit tangled up in his statements and said, and I quote, "It's not about 2 months." Notably, the Kremlin dictator himself remained silent. Obviously, he doesn't want to be held responsible for the risk of yet another reputational failure. Let me remind you that in June 2024, on the eve of the peace summit in Switzerland, Putin also demanded the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions within their administrative borders. Otherwise, he threatened to seize everything by force in the shortest possible time. And back in February 2022, he even called on the entire Ukrainian army to lay down their arms.
In recent days, against the backdrop of Russian ports and oil refineries being destroyed, we've been seeing some strange moves from the Kremlin. It seems they've fallen into despair after military failures and unsuccessful attempts to break us through the Americans, and now they're resorting to their last argument: magical incantations. One of these is an ultimatum to Ukraine demanding that we withdraw our troops from Donbas within 2 months, or else the next terms will be even worse. And all the main Kremlin spokespersons are voicing these threats at once, just in case Moscow's threats weren't heard the first time. Yehor Chernyev, head of Ukraine's permanent delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, on Facebook.
So, where did these 2 months come from? Why exactly this time frame? Many experts believe that Putin wants to use his favorite tactic again and drag things out. The United States is holding its midterm congressional elections on November 3rd, and by the end of May, the election campaign in the country will be in full swing. The Kremlin is counting on the Trump administration to become completely focused on domestic issues and stop demanding that Russia upholds its agreements. However, some believe that this is just a typical information and psychological operation by the Kremlin to create the illusion of strength where it's clearly lacking. The Russians have been trying to capture the Donetsk region for 12 years now, and even 2 months after their ultimatum expires, they still won't be able to change the situation on the battlefield.
All claims that Russian troops will be able to easily capture the rest of the Donetsk region, let alone launch large scale offensives to seize major metropolitan cities in other regions far from the front line, are completely unfounded and frankly absurd, and they simply do not reflect reality. The current situation on the battlefield and Ukraine's recent counterattacks clearly demonstrate the fact that significant Russian gains at the front are highly improbable at this stage, especially when it comes to the large and well fortified cities of Ukraine's defensive belt in the Donetsk region. From the Institute for the Study of War report.
This week, Russian propagandists also spread a fake story about the complete capture of the Luhansk region. The Ministry of Defense of the aggressor country reported that supposedly the West Group units have fully accomplished this task. By the way, this isn't the first time they've spread such claims. At least 3 times, the Russians have already boasted about this so called victory, but neither military analysts nor deep state maps confirm this. Units of the 3rd Assault Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine are holding the settlements of Nadia, Novoegorivka, and Kharkivka on the border of Luhansk and Kharkiv regions. All attempts by the occupiers to break through in this area over the past 6 months have been unsuccessful, and their assault groups have suffered heavy losses.
In 6 months, the enemy has made 144 attempts at assault operations in the area of Nadia and Novoegorivka, including the use of 19 pieces of motorized equipment and more than 360 soldiers. Of these, Russia's irrecoverable losses amount to up to 260 personnel killed in action and more than 80 wounded. From a report by the 3rd Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces on Telegram.
In March, Russian occupiers suffered the highest personnel losses since the beginning of the year. The armed forces of Ukraine neutralized 31,960 soldiers, killed and wounded. These are the initial results of Russia's spring summer offensive campaign, which failed almost immediately after it began. Obviously, fewer and fewer people are willing to sign contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense, and the Kremlin has to drown out all this negativity with fake news about imaginary victories or with threatening ultimatums. Another very interesting statistic was published by the BBC Russian service. According to their data, nearly 20,000 Russian soldiers under the age of 25 have died during the full scale invasion of Ukraine. The youngest of them was 18 years and 31 days old. At the same time, it's important to note that these figures are based solely on open sources. The real picture is much more grim.
The number of those killed between the ages of 18 and 25 at this point is at least 19,583 people, and it began to steadily increase starting in March 2024. Moreover, this trend was not observed in other age groups. It was at that moment that an amendment was passed allowing people who had only been detained on suspicion of a crime to avoid trial and criminal liability. They are promised this if they sign a contract for military service. From a publication by the BBC Russian service,
And here are a few more telling numbers. Since the beginning of the year, the Russian army has lost about 89,000 soldiers killed and wounded. At the same time, they managed to recruit only 80,000 people into the army. In other words, losses exceed the rate of replenishment. On top of that, the Kremlin's financial resources are also running dry. On March 26th, Putin held a closed meeting with Russian oligarchs and demanded that they chip in for the war against Ukraine. Bloomberg also reports that Moscow is betting on prolonging the aggression and hopes to buy time. The Russian army is unable to break through the defenses of Ukrainian armed forces, and negotiations are currently on hold.
negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, led by the US, have reached a deadlock, and there are no signs that talks about a possible peace agreement will resume anytime soon. The Russian army is preparing for a new offensive campaign, according to sources familiar with discussions in the Kremlin and the situation on the front line. Without a breakthrough in negotiations, the war could drag on for another year or two, one of them said, from a Bloomberg publication.
Making concessions to Russia, given all the previous experience of the full scale war, would be extremely dangerous and short sighted, warned the head of EU diplomacy, Kaja Kallas. Brussels emphasizes attempts to achieve a quick peace at Ukraine's expense only increase the threat from the aggressor country and create a dangerous precedent. The EU has no doubt the Kremlin's appetite won't be limited to just the Donetsk region. There is one aggressor and one victim. Of course, if the victim surrendered, you would get a quick deal. But that's not a lasting peace because the aggressor's appetite will only grow. And Donbas isn't the final goal if Russia gets it so easily. I mean, they haven't been able to conquer it in 12 years, and now they're hoping it will be handed over at the negotiating table. Kahaya Kallis, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, in an interview with RBC Ukraine. Well, the louder the Kremlin's ultimatums, the more obvious it is that they have no real arguments behind them. Having failed to achieve success on the battlefield, Moscow is trying to impose its agenda through pressure, fake news, and threats. And any concessions in such a situation will only give the aggressor time to recover losses and prepare for a new attack. And the next phase of the war could turn out to be even larger, more destructive, and bloodier.